Welcome back to Guerrilla Radio's continuing efforts, not broadcast live from CFUV Radio in the basement of the Student Union building at the University of Victoria, but emanating live to tape via SteamYard from our home-based studio on this day, July 22nd, 2020. Well, federal troops are in Portland. Nearly 2 months into daily police brutality demonstrations there, the president decided to deploy the Minneapolis treatment, or as Attorney General Bill Barr calls it, the Occupy model. And there are other cities slated too to receive the same. Itinerant musician and now COVID-caged broadcaster David Rovics is in Portland, where his relatively mild-mannered home city has suddenly become the center of Civil War 2.020. As he can't tour, David is doing the next best thing, raising hell on the internet and helping foment a renters' strike. Welcome back to the program. David, before getting to the fire in the streets, I think it's 3 of the last 4 years, fire has been the big story out of Portland. We've had a late summer up here in BC. What's the forest situation like down there?
It's been just recently been hot in the 90s Fahrenheit. We still use Fahrenheit, but but it has not been much in the way of fires this part of Oregon, as far as I know. Certainly, the air smells pretty good most of the time. So it's
it might smell good, because of that, but not in Portland itself. Now, I saw what you put up on Sky or on Twitter rather. The Wall of Moms, so-called. Tell me who the Wall of Moms were and what happened to them last night.
Two nights ago, they were attacked and tear gassed and by federal officers that stormed out of the building. And then I believe the same thing happened last night, although I don't know if the Wall of Moms was all lined up at the time that the attack happened last night. 2 nights ago, the mom wall was lined up and linked up arm in arm when the federal officers stormed out of the building with massive amounts of various so-called non-lethal munitions.
I think they call it less lethal now because for obvious reasons. They came out guns blazing, tear gas going as well. And this, for the people that don't know, this is literally a wall of people, a human wall made up of moms. I saw a tweet of a university professor who had been shot in the head. I'm not sure with what. It wasn't one of those high velocity gas canisters because she wouldn't be there to take a picture, I think. But this idea that this idea of maximum force being deployed by the federales down there, what's your take on what Barr calls and what has become called the Occupy model?
I mean, it's a very interesting comment on Barr's part because it is absolutely accurate. I mean, other than the snatch squads taking people, kidnapping them off the street and holding them for several hours without charge and then letting them go, I don't recall that happening during Occupy, but it's not like that's a new tactic in the United States, although that is being talked about. It's being talked about as a new tactic and as the sort of disappearing kind of thing that the CIA has trained other police forces to do all over the world. But it's also not a new tactic here. And I can name people that I know personally who have been kidnapped off the streets of various cities in this country going back many decades and taken to police stations, military bases, and all sorts of other places. So, I mean, the sort of police as terrorists, there's nothing new about that. Of course, I'm not saying that a fascist takeover by Trump and canceling the November elections, so that would be new. I mean, there's all kinds of potential for new things to happen. But what's happening is not necessarily new, but it's certainly getting a lot of attention. It's also, I think, important to note that the Portland police have been tear gassing and brutalizing people just about every night of the week for the past 50 days until the feds came in and started doing more of the same, only a little more sort of dramatically.
Well, I've seen reports of Wheeler, your Portland's mayor, and the governor, Kate Brown, I think it is. They're complaining about the feds coming in. Is this just a turf war? It's like, oh, no, nobody beats my people. I beat them. Is this the idea?
That is absolutely the idea. And of course, they wouldn't say that, and they'd pretend to be horrified if such accusations were made. But the fact is, I would bet anything on if there was a Democrat in the White House especially a Democrat who was remotely popular, and they sent in federal troops to help with policing the streets of Portland, you would not hear anybody complaining in the Capitol or in City Hall, at least as far as the mayor goes. But it is absolutely a political. It's political on their parts. They maybe they really are scared of sort of a fascist takeover and military rule and that sort of thing, because that is one of the possible items on the agenda if that's where Trump is going with these efforts to send federal officers to cities around the country. That may be a real fear of theirs. It's certainly a real fear of many other people, but I'm pretty sure none of them, they wouldn't be making a fuss unless it were a Republican doing it.
Well, are they just doing this in blue states? Are we seeing any red states get the Occupy model treatment, or is this just the limp left wing places like Portland and maybe California?
Well, Trump is talking about basically he's very explicitly talking about sending federal officers to cities that are ruled by the Democrats, and which it's in his view are the cities that have the most unruly populations and police departments that are least able to dominate the streets, as he would like police departments to do all over the country. I think there may actually be, like with Barr's Occupy model comments, there may be actually some grains, more than a few grains of truth in Trump's impressions about the progressive cities being more unruly. But I think that is because actually the so-called progressive cities ruled by so-called progressives are actually also happen to be the most expensive, unaffordable cities in the country, where people of color and artists and working class people generally have been driven out in droves over the past several decades. So you have cities like Portland, San Francisco, Oakland, Seattle, New York City, Boston. They're all run by supposed progressives who have been presiding over the ethnic cleansing of their cities and the carrying out of untold numbers of evictions carried out by their very well-funded and very heavily militarized police departments. So, somebody can tell me what's progressive about these cities. I don't know, and neither does Trump. But certainly there's a lot of opposition recently to the rule of these so-called progressive cities. And I can guarantee that the opposition is not only related to police brutality directed against Black people, although that was the catalyst.
Well, even up here in Canada, and I know in the States, you think of us up here as being generally more progressive, but police violence in our cities is pretty common, and it's been a big issue up here, and especially federal police violence against First Nations, which is seeing a smaller scale but similar protest that the Black Lives Matter is getting down south. But here, our cities too are unaffordable, and I wonder if it's not so much an ethnic cleansing up here as an economic one.
Yeah, I mean, it's largely it's an economic thing, but it just gets reflected so much in terms of race, because economics and race are very intertwined here. But it's not that, of course, the majority of poverty is white poverty, like the majority of the population here. It's just a matter of disproportionate amounts of Black poverty, and especially when you're talking about wealth as opposed to income, because when you're talking about inherited houses and that sort of thing, this is a common phenomenon among the white population, and a very uncommon phenomenon in the Black and brown populations, who are overwhelmingly renters, whereas most white people are at least nominally homeowners, which of course often means the banks own their homes, but at least they're not necessarily renters.
Well, if you just tuned in, you're listening to Guerrilla Radio. I'm speaking today to David Rovics. David's down in Portland. He's an itinerant musician, trapped now by COVID, as so many people are, and found himself in his hometown in the center of Civil War, as I call it, 2.020. Well, David, I know you're doing a lot of work with the renters strike and on this issue. I saw one of your posts where it was an open letter that you sent out to your landlords, a corporate landlord. Do you want to talk a little bit about not necessarily your own position, but that too, if you like, but this idea of renters strike? And I'm specifically concerned because we're seeing it in Canada too, that the eviction moratoriums that we've had up here because of COVID are all set to run out at the end of this month. And I understand that's the same in the States.
Yeah. And I mean, of course, we have in Canada, you have a sort of a UBI going on, right? Universal basic income is basically sort of on throughout the country for the time being, right? Everybody's getting 200 Canadian dollars in their bank accounts. Not everybody. Most people.
And there's scandal and there's a difficulty in people, as I've heard you talk about your experiences as well. People that are eligible aren't getting it.
Is that widespread?
I can't tell you how widespread it is. I'm not getting it, but then I'm on another system because I got laid off the day before the program started.
Yeah, and here there is no UBI going on, but there were the one-off $1,200 payments to anybody making less than $100,000 a year that came from the feds, and that I did receive, and I think most anybody who files taxes and gave the IRS their bank account information did receive that. But anybody who doesn't file taxes through direct deposit or get their returns that way is relying on getting a check in the mail. And by their own admission, the IRS said that those checks in the mail are going to take months. And I know people who are waiting for the checks. They're still waiting for it after 3 months. And the unemployment department is just broken in the state of Oregon. And this is true in many other states. I think not all of them. I think from what I've heard, New York State's unemployment department is fairly well organized, but it's a disaster in most of the country, in Florida, Texas, and in Oregon. I mean, the amount that people would be receiving from the state is just absolutely pathetic. I mean, I don't know how anybody ever survives on that. I'm sure they don't. But with the pandemic, there's this extra $600 a week that the federal government has been guaranteeing. That runs out at the end of this month, along with the eviction moratorium around the country. Many states like Oregon has an eviction moratorium that goes till the end of September now. It was extended just recently. It was going to expire at the end of June, but they extended it. So basically in Oregon, anybody who is a renter is they don't necessarily have to be paying rent now. They won't get evicted. At least they don't face forced eviction. Of course but once that the eviction moratorium ends, if there isn't the kind of more federal government support that would be needed, like the kind of thing that at least many unemployed people have been getting, this extra $600 a week, which I have not been getting. I applied 3 months ago and I've still seen nothing. And that's true of apparently the vast majority of gig economy workers in the state of Oregon. Although we qualify, we have not seen a cent from the state. And by their own admission, they fired the head of the department, but she was not responsible for the problem. The problem goes back many decades. They are running this department on Fortran and COBOL, right? Those are languages that you have to be kind of like, I think, roughly around our age to even know what they are.
I studied that in college in 1983.
Right?
So, yeah.
I graduated from high school in '85, and so when I was in high school, COBOL and Fortran were both kind of getting phased out, and other languages were coming in, I believe. But I don't know. I only C++, right? Yeah. So I was like, I didn't even study those languages. I was just like born a little too late. So they're actually getting people like in their 80s out of retirement who learned how to program back in the 70s. Who know these languages.
It was terrible too, as I remember it. But what about? Are the landlords being made whole by the government during this eviction moratorium, or do the renters that haven't paid rent during the moratorium, do they, when it's over, have to come up with back rent as well?
Yeah. Yeah, that's
They
the
do.
thing. Like, so what's going on is basically like the state of Oregon has done the best job in the country at kicking the can down the road, basically, as far as the eviction moratorium goes. But no state has done anything better than that. Only the city of Ithaca in New York is the one city that has actually canceled rent for at least the first 3 months of the pandemic, and they're being challenged by the landlord lobby in the courts. But basically, what's what the backdrop here is what's happened since 2008, since the financial crash of 2008, is a massive consolidation of the housing market by huge corporations like the one that owns the building I live in, the Randall Group and Prime Group, and all kinds of other big corporations that own hundreds of buildings up and down the coast, in different parts of the country, and internationally. The investors are who are real estate is one of the most profitable things for capitalists to invest in, and that is true whether you're a small-time capitalist buying 5 or 6 houses and being what they call a so-called mom and pop landlord, which I think is a totally inappropriate term for a capitalist who is living off of their rental properties. So that's called capitalism, and the person doing that is called a capitalist.
Well,
and
it's the rentier economy, as it's called.
Yeah, okay. Rentier, I hadn't heard that term, but you use French words more often up there, probably.
Well, this is basically, it's a French word for parasite, I think.
Oh, parasite. Yeah, we call them parasites. Yeah, definitely.
There's a suspension on evictions. Stick to your convictions. Don't pay the rent. If at home we have to stay, then most of us can't pay, so don't pay the rent. Tell your landlord, sir, that mortgage can defer, and don't pay the rent. If they start rattling their sabers, say I need to feed my neighbors, and don't pay the rent. It's time now to demand one big union grand. Don't pay the rent. Neoliberalism is dead. It's time to raise your head and don't pay the rent. Strike for the guarantee, a home for everybody. Don't pay the rent. Running water, housing, healthcare all across the earth we share, yeah. Don't pay the rent. Has failed, put the billionaires in jail. Don't pay the rent. We need a new world now. Let me tell you how. And don't pay the rent. With mutual aid, a new world can be made. Don't pay the rent. From the ashes of the old, if we stop doing what we're told, and don't pay the rent. Solidarity with society. Don't pay the rent. Our lives matter a lot. The landlord's profits do not. Don't pay the rent. We can redefine what is theirs and ours and mine if we don't pay the rent. There's a suspension on evictions. Stick to your convictions. Don't pay the rent.
But then, many of those those small-time parasites actually had, lost their property into the 2008 crisis. And so what's happened, and of course, loads of just, people who owned one home, and whether or not they had a subprime mortgage, they lost their jobs and they lost their homes. So there's massive foreclosure crisis. And what happened from that is the big banks and investment groups just bought up massive amounts of property, and they hire management companies to manage their properties, just like smaller landlords often do, so they can sleep at night and have a real sort of separation from the renters whose lives they are constantly immiserating. I mean, my rent has gone up by 250% since I moved to Portland in 2007, and that's typical. And so, it's a totally unconscionable thing for any human being to do to another human being. So, of course, it helps that they're big corporations with investors that are so far removed from the human equation that to be able to do the things that they do. But and it's many of the investors who invest in these big corporations are not even from this country. Not that makes a difference, but we're talking about actually no small number of Norwegians. If there's any Norwegians out there listening, your sovereign wealth fund, that massive multi-trillion-dollar sovereign wealth fund, is a very big problem for us here. And for a lot of people also in London, your sovereign wealth fund is being used to destroy people's lives. And they may have divested from the arms industry, but they sure have not divested from real estate, and which is just as immoral as the arms industry. Housing is a human right, and here it is clearly just a privilege. And you can see that on the streets of every major American city with the tents and the people living in their cars, and the poverty is just astounding.
Canadian cities too, David. I mean, and especially Vancouver, where there was a massive condominium building boom over the last couple of decades. And a lot of them sit empty because they're just receptacles of investment money. The politicians that are focused on this issue call them cash boxes in the skies. And there are people living in the streets, even in Little Victoria here too, in growing numbers. When this eviction, the eviction moratoriums that we've had in place here, which were announced they would be ended at the end of this month, happened. We're wondering what's going to happen here. I know that in the States, you guys are envious of our healthcare system up here in Canada. Down there, you've got this curious mechanism that a lot of people's healthcare are connected to their jobs. So when there's this big downturn and people are losing their jobs in the middle of this pandemic, they're losing their healthcare and now maybe their homes too. What's being expressed down there? I mean, who is addressing this issue of this? Not only the impending surge of homelessness, but all of these people being released into a pandemic strewn country.
Yeah, I mean, it's
healthcare at all.
It's being talked about an awful lot, including in the mainstream press. It's now very common to see a headline in the business press, Wall Street Journal, Marketplace on NPR, whatever. It's very common to see headlines like, between now and September, there are projected to be between 20 to 28 million evictions in the United States. And, clearly, and people are not only facing the prospect of not being able to afford rent, but not being able to afford food. And that is already happening. And many of the food banks are serving 2, 3, 4 times as many clients as they normally do. There's massive long lines, people lining up with their cars to get the trunk full of groceries. There's been numbers talked about in the mainstream media that possibly as many as 1 in 4 children in this country are going to bed hungry. It's really a catastrophic situation that we're facing, especially once the unemployment runs out and the eviction moratoriums expire. So it's such a catastrophic situation that we're facing here that any politician who has half a brain cell left will tend to realize that this is a catastrophe that needs to be dealt with. But it's unclear, what they're going to do. I mean, certainly there's going to be another so-called, stimulus package. But the stimulus package is, according to somebody I talked to who has studied this more, like in terms of the details more than I have, they say that 10-1, the stimulus has gone to big corporations, and which may very well include the company that owns the building I live in. I have no idea. That they never communicate with us about such things.
Well, if they're big enough, I'm still gobsmacked by that number. 28 plus million people, that's more than 3/4 of the entire population of Canada. Seeing that many people put out onto the streets is unthinkable.
Bank is empty, card is full, and no matter how hard I pull, the car don't move, the rent is due, I'm not sure what else to do. get a job. Perhaps I should, pulling shots or hauling wood. It's a bit too late right now for that, so in the meantime, here's my hat. 'Cause this world I can't afford. I'm throwing a party for my landlord. 'Cause this world I can't afford. I'm throwing a party for my landlord. My landlord is a company which takes away all my money, as well as that of half the town. They're slumlords of great renown. The Randall Group, the group of Randall. You can bet they don't need to panhandle. They own my building, they might own yours, along with all of your mold spores. 'Cause this world I can't afford. I'm throwing a party for my landlord. 'Cause this world I can't afford. I'm throwing a party for my landlord. 'Cause at that time the rent is due. This is a red line for me, don't know about you. Everything else just comes to a halt when you get thrown out onto the asphalt. Call it funding from the crowd. Sounds so nice, rhymes with cloud. Call it begging, I don't care, long as Randall gets their share. 'Cause this world I can't afford. I'm throwing a party for my landlord. 'Cause this world I can't afford. I'm throwing a party for my landlord. I'm throwing a party for my landlord.
What's unthinkable too is that the military budget, your defense so-called budget in the United States, your Senate just voted down a very meager amendment to reduce its budget by 10%, overwhelmingly. I think the numbers were like 70-something to 20 against, with many Democrats voting to keep that super bloated budget going, even now when money is so badly needed by the people.
Yeah, it just shows how bankrupt this democracy is and how the two parties don't have the people's interests at heart. And I mean, despite, of course, you got a few wonderful radicals within the Democratic Party. I'm definitely a fan of Ilhan Omar and Alexandria, Ocasio-Cortez, and there's several good folks in the Congress who I would love to see in more powerful positions. But and certainly the Congress would be a whole different institution if the majority of the Congress were made up of people like Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But it's not, and both parties are white supremacist institutions. And imperialist institutions, and they both very much support all the military spending and all the wars. And we've had as many wars started by Democrats as started by Republicans. And if they were started by one party, they've been supported by the other. So it's just a fantasy to think that the Democratic Party is the more progressive party of the two, although it may be less inclined to a fascist takeover. They do get elected more often because they tend to have it's a slightly better election strategy when you can at least appeal to the sort of actual intersectionality of a very diverse society, and rather than the Republican strategy, which is to serve the rich and then appeal to your white supremacist base that's shrinking. Your white base which is shrinking, and your the white supremacist base within the white base, which might be shrinking even faster. I don't know, but it's definitely a problem for the Republicans to keep getting elected. So their strategy is to basically make the election as impossible as possible, by not funding the post office, not allowing vote by mail during a pandemic, by basically getting rid of so many people's ability to vote because they have some history of a felony or even a misdemeanor. And there's all kinds of, they owe taxes, they owe parking tickets, whatever. They find so many different ways. It's very much like Jim Crow, except they're not doing literacy tests at the voting booth anymore.
Well, the terrific American journalist, Greg Palast, when he doesn't call it Jim Crow anymore, when he's done a lot of work on the election system, and he's just come out with a new book, actually, How Trump Stole 2020. But he says it's not Jim Crow anymore, it's Dr. James Crow, and because these methods are more sophisticated now, but they'll just, one of the tricks they use to disenfranchise mainly black voters of color is to say that they've moved addresses, and because they've moved addresses, they can't register to vote again, even though they haven't moved at all. They don't know they've moved, but in the books, that's what it says. And he says 17 million voters have been disenfranchised.
And also worth noting that even way back, in 12, 13 years ago, by the time Obama first got elected, millions of voters had already been disenfranchised, and he still won by millions of votes. But he would have won by millions more votes if not for all the voters who had been disenfranchised already at that point. Well,
the American system is a bizarre one, frankly, to us. But then I don't want to be high-handed here in Canada. Ours is broken as well. With this COVID outbreak, though, and with mail-in votes being disallowed or attempted to be disallowed by the president and his party, how do you think Americans are going to vote? I mean, if this pandemic continues or even grows as the autumn comes, maybe the president will cancel elections altogether, not with a boot, but with a stroke of a pen.
I mean, it seems to me that, I don't know, it's like for left-wing intellectuals with a history penchant to make predictions, tends to go wrong. I think every time the reality is way too complex to actually be able to make accurate predictions. I don't know of too many people who do make accurate predictions. Unless they just predict everything and then see what happens later, like Trump does,
I predicted Trump would win the last election, but
me too.
I was kidding though. I wasn't serious. I just said it to piss somebody off. And, and I was as surprised as anybody, I got to admit. But now I wonder. I'm saying he's going to win again, so maybe I'll be wrong twice.
Well, I predicted he'd win in 2016, but I could have been wrong. But it just so happened that of my two options, I predicted the right one. I think I had a lot of reasons to predict his. I mean, he was running a popular, what they call a populist campaign that he was making a lot of sense in a lot of stuff he was saying. If you forget about all the constant racism, which is also part of his appeal, certainly, but he was also talking about a lot of other things that he didn't carry forth on at all, like reviving American industry and getting out of all these free trade deals and putting the American worker first and all this kind of stuff. I mean, he didn't do any of that, but getting the military out of all these different countries, ending these wars. I mean, he basically failed at doing pretty much all of the stuff he said he was going to do. That was what got him elected. But he was running on that kind of platform, basically outflanking Hillary Clinton on both the left and the right. And, which is actually impossible to do for anybody who's really, thinking clearly. But this is also what fascists do. That's what fascism is all about. It's both a left and a right wing phenomenon, which is why it has such popularity compared to just plain old authoritarian rule.
Well, it was amazing to me how he just ran through the Republican elite like they weren't even there, just scattering them to the winds. The all-powerful Bush family as well, just crumpled like paper. I saw Hillary Clinton reappear, or maybe it was the ghost of Hillary Clinton. I'm not sure, but she was with Biden. Is there a chance, do you think, then? I know you don't like to predict, David, but I mean, does this mean that she's sniffing around for a VP position with Biden?
I mean, that would be so perfect in terms of the two completely corrupt, failed politicians running against Trump. That might just in itself guarantee a Trump victory.
Something, exactly what nobody knows. Whatever the future will bring, whichever way it goes, depends on how we get there, the scope of our demands. Everything's up in the air, wherever we might land. Welcome to the precipice. Something, you can't stand there for long. Hear the church bells ring, another homecoming song. As the state just pulled the rug, left us to wonder why. As the mass graves are dug for the essential workers sentenced to die. Welcome to the precipice. Something, so many people say things have got to change now, they can't stay this way. Whatever lies ahead can't be the status quo. Doggy dog is dead, long may it be so. Welcome to the precipice. Welcome
what Biden is always talking about is that his vice president will be a black woman, which just seems so pandering to talk about the race and gender of the person that you're going to pick before you even pick the person. Why not pick a black woman and then say, this is the person that I picked? I don't know. It just seems a little reductionist to talk about it the way he's talking about it. But it seems like his plan is to pick a black woman for his to be VP, and I can guarantee that whoever it is he picks will be a very mainstream Democrat with no interest in changing the basic structure of American society as a society ruled by extremely wealthy corporations and on behalf of the global rich.
Well, if Bill Clinton was the first black president, maybe Hillary will be the first black vice president.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's that possibility, right?
If you just tuned in again, you're listening to Guerrilla Radio. I'm speaking to David Rovics today. David is an itinerant musician. David, you've got so much stuff going on. I mean, I think you're busier than you ever have been because of the pandemic. You've got your David Rovics, your Twitter, your PSCP TV, your discussions with David about the Popular Resistance is airing on Facebook and over your own sites as well. The Fit the State with, I was just listening to one of your shows before we went on with Eric Larson, a terrific show, and earlier this week with Mike Crenshaw of Against Against Racist Action or something like that?
Anti-racist action, yeah.
Well, so now how do you manage to do this and raise a family and get so involved with this renter strike that you're active in down there in Portland?
Well, I mean, basically what I used to do before the pandemic was I spent about 6 months out of a typical year traveling and playing music and touring. And that's a very full on occupation. And, it's a sort of a 24/7 kind of thing. And then when I was home with the family, I was with the family, and I was also booking the next tour and occasionally doing gigs locally. So that was very busy, and I didn't have time with that kind of stuff going on for a regular, to host a regular interview show kind of thing. I was more like doing But I was even while touring, I was still managing to put out like one podcast a week. And what I'm doing now is 5 every weekday. And it's very busy for sure. But if I don't keep busy, then I will lose my mind. So it's, I love my children, but, playing with toddlers and babies does not do wonders for my mental health if that's all I'm doing. I need adult conversation, and I need to be plugged into some kind of social movement activity. And that was always really easy to do as a traveling musician, although it was always like I was kind of the cheerleader for lots of different movements around the world without really being really involved with any particular one movement, because I was, as you say, itinerant, basically.
Missile strikes in Baghdad, skies full of fighter jets. The tension in the air, as thick as it gets. Their talking points are loaded at each press conference with what passes for an effort at historical reference. They talk of things that happened over 40 years before, that they say now bring us to the edge of world war. They talk about the hostages, so let us now rewind. When the students took the embassy, just what did they find when the students took the embassy? I was just a kid, but I remember well the first things they did. Let all the women go while collecting all the trash, all the shredded documents that weren't yet turned to ash, all the shredded documents that clearly showed the torture and corruption, how the power flowed. The concept of a captured state was one the Shah defined. When the students took the embassy, just what did they find? When the students took the embassy, they found the crimes of Sadak, had the CIA hiding under every rock. And that's where they had been, where the agents were based. They had a staff of thousands there, from there they laid to waste the dreams held by so many for a free society, like the one they overthrew back in 1953. Historic crimes exposed in the shredder once consigned. When the students took the embassy, just what did they find when the students took the embassy?
Although I do live somewhere, and I've lived somewhere for a long time, but I've spent half of the year on the road for most years for the past, since the 90s, more than half the year earlier on before I had kids. It was more like 10 months a year of touring. I'm still busy. It's just a different kind of busy. So it's, and people often ask how I can do 5 shows a week. And I wonder myself, because it is a real full on thing, and I'm going to probably cut it down to 3 by September, so I can have more time to focus on other things like the impending evictions coming, and I haven't been able to go downtown I don't usually stay up till the middle of the night because of the small kids, so that gets in the way of participating in some of the protests, yeah, if I'm not broadcasting 5 mornings a week, I'll have a little more time to participate in some of that.
Well, it is frightening times. We've seen that the arts, and especially the performing arts, have been really creamed by the coronavirus. You were talking a little bit about this with Mike Crenshaw. How are you managing, or are you managing to actually make money when you can't perform, and that was your major source of income?
Yeah, I personally, I had tours lined up in 9 countries that I had to cancel as a result of the pandemic. And but actually, the thing is, the music industry has been in a perpetual state of collapse for like 20 years now, more than 20 years. And but the real death knell of it, in terms of being able to really make a living according to the more traditional model of touring, selling CDs at your gigs, and then recording another CD and touring on that and selling more CDs. I mean, it seemed like a very difficult way to make a living back in the 90s, but in actuality, it's a fantasy. It was a fantasy compared to now. because you could sell CDs. And if people liked your music, they'd buy them because that's how they were going to get them, get your music. But as it turned out, once it all became free and you just had to listen to some ads on Spotify and you could have access to all the world's music, quite naturally, buying CDs became less popular. And also people, at least here in the United States, as well as in some other countries, incomes are declining, rents are going up. I mean, people have less disposable income for doing things like buying CDs, even if they didn't have a Spotify on their phones with access to all the world's music. So I totally would have done the same thing. And I did, I mean, I listen to music online too now as well. I don't even have a CD player. I mean, I'm not suggesting anything, people should move back in time and buy CD players or something, but the traditional model broke a long time ago. So for people so basically when you look at the difference between the 2000 census and the 2010 census in the US, you find there are 41% fewer people who call themselves musicians, and by which they mean in the professional sense, right? Of course, there's still just as many or more people playing music, but in terms of making a living, 41% fewer between those two censuses, and it's gotten much worse since then. We just don't have the data, or I don't have the data. But basically, when Spotify started their free platform in 2013, that really killed any vestige of independent music, survival. It kind of did what Uber did to the taxi industry. But so for musicians who still wanted to try to stay in the game and not get another job and survive as musicians, what basically developed was your only option was getting subsidized somehow. So for some European musicians, that can involve government subsidies in various forms, just like for European journalists with the collapsing industry of journalism. I mean, there's various ways to keep musicians playing music and keep journalists doing journalism, but it requires government subsidies. At least that's the model they've followed in places like Sweden. But in the U.S., where there is no support for the arts or for journalism, for that matter, people have had to go the model of crowdsourced, support. Unless you're got a billionaire sponsor like The Intercept or something like that. But basically, you need to crowdsource your survival, and you're not going to do it through CD sales, which is another form of crowdsourcing. It's just more sort of straightforward transactional. But the form of crowdsourcing that I adopted and many other musicians did was like the Patreon kind of model, where you get people to send you money every month or year or whatever in exchange for music and other stuff that you're basically giving away for free anyway. And I just only really, as of last winter, it was when I basically managed to get that whole patronage thing happening to the degree where I can actually survive and pay the rent and feed myself and my family on the money from patronage, just barely. So that timing was coincidental, but totally that happened at the same time as the pandemic hit. Basically just before the pandemic hit, I had ramped up patronage to the point where I didn't necessarily need to be touring all the time anymore. And actually touring, even at the best of times, I would spend half the money I make touring, I'd spend on touring. So without CD sales, you really are, touring is like, if you can just make a little bit of money, come home with a little bit more money than you left with, you're doing good these days. So touring became just basically a hobby, and a less and less happy kind of hobby because, before I had kids, I might have just done it for fun. But, when you're spending a month or two in Europe and your kids don't hardly remember who you are by the time you get back, I mean, that's not, it's no longer nearly as fun as it used to be. So,
Are people still lynched in America? And what happens when they die? When he begged for his mother to save him, was he resisting arrest when he cried? And how does the lynch mob roam free when we already know who they are? The men who murdered George Floyd and then drove off in their police cars. To live with such savage injustice, with every new day the earth turns, I'm left with no reason to wonder as I watch Minneapolis burn. Are people still lynched in America? How many just in the past weeks? From Georgia to Minnesota, as the pandemic spikes and peaks. Did you see him pinned down for 8 minutes? Did you see the knee on his neck? Did you see the police station on fire? Did you smell the smoldering wreck? As the National Guard marches in, watch the wheels of history churn in the land of Philando Castile, as we watch Minneapolis burn. Are people still lynched in America? And do the poor still die of disease? Are the prisons still full of debtors? Do bodies still hang from the trees? Do the workers still live by the highways? Still struggle to come up with rent? Do families still get evicted when the last of their credit is spent? Do you see all the people who just had to find out what might there be left to learn from the flames that rise from the target as we watch Minneapolis burn? Are people still lynched in America? And what happens when they die? When he begged for his mother to save him, was he resisting arrest when he cried?
That's so. I was already transitioning away from touring and towards the patronage model and towards like doing more stuff online anyway. Not because I necessarily love doing stuff online. I'd rather be playing for real audiences and stuff. But it's certainly the pandemic sped that whole thing along, and I actually learned how to use a microphone on a live stream. Only just recently. To get this.
Well, yeah, it's a huge learning curve and all these new platforms coming up. I think, you've really chosen wisely going into progressive political discourse. So that's a money maker for sure.
I don't know about that, but it seems to entertain my audience. Okay.
Well, you have to keep going. And you've done so much work, I know, to build up your audience, and patreon.com, you go David Rovics, do a search there and you can support David's work that way, and as well as all your political work and your touring and everything else. You've written hundreds and hundreds of songs, and I see you've got a couple new ones up just now, and one of them about the prisoner, winner. I wanted to say Chelsea, but
right. Another very much cut out of the same cloth, the two of them. I mean, in terms of the kind of, intelligence processor people working for such agencies who blew the whistle on really important things and went to prison for it. And Chelsea Manning, I think last I heard she was released from prison for now, but she's constantly being rearrested for refusing to testify against Julian Assange.
Yeah,
but
of course,
and he's in prison in London, and with all kinds of health complications, and everybody's terrified about what's going to happen to him with COVID-19. And now Reality Winner is in prison in Texas, and she's one of 500 women in her prison that has gotten COVID-19.
She was born in 1991. She was raised beneath the southern sun. Since she was quite young, she sought to find a way to come up with solutions to the problems of the day. She learned lots of languages, lots of other things, which top secret clearance can bring. Many people say the truth will set you free. Tell that to reality. She analyzed the intercepts from Al-Qaeda and IS, did her best to ascertain the right address, send in the drone strikes, and fight the war that she once believed in wholeheartedly before. She found the information she knew people had to know, as the prosecution's evidence shows. Many people say the truth will set you free. Tell that to reality. into effect which presidential candidate voters would elect. She thought this could not be secret. This we know is true. And she was convinced of what she had to do. Now she's held in solitary in a Texas prison cell. It's another gaping hole in the Liberty Bell. Many people say the truth will set you free. Tell that to reality. She was born in 1991.
Well, you talked about intersectionality, and I was really interested with in the interview you did with Mike Crenshaw, again, of Anti-Racist Action. This whole COVID thing, it seems like the synecdoche of the capitalist failure, the crashing of capitalism, where we see the prison system, we see the homelessness issue, the explosion of rent costs in the cities and even outside the cities in America, Canada, and in Europe too. All of these things coming together, the healthcare crisis as well, in one great crashing boom. You know, I don't know if there's a question to this, David, but I mean, this is where we are, and yet we're still seeing stories about, you know, it's Selena Gomez's birthday today.
Yeah, it is just, it's an incredible disconnect. I mean, when you, and then, you know, the experiences that so many different people are having with the pandemic. I mean, it's just so all over the place, and it is such a massive gulf between. I mean, there's always a massive gulf between the privileged and the you know, disenfranchised. But the gulf is just widening so much, despite all the, you know, or maybe partly because of and partly in spite of the efforts by, you know, state and federal governments here to do something to prevent widespread hunger, which they've done up till now. You know, I mean, this it can't be overstated how much of a difference the expanded unemployment you know, has done for the unemployed, the 30 million unemployed people in this country right now. You know, this the extra $600 a week has made the difference between, you know, surviving and not surviving. You know, because I mean, people. I mean, if you don't get that extra 600, it's astoundingly enough, if you're a relatively low wage worker and you're unemployed, you're looking at getting like $200 or less a week from state unemployment. And this is in a situation where over 50% of low wage workers, I think actually 50% of renters generally, I think this is accurate, but I'm going on memory here. But I believe 50% of renters in the United States are already spending half of their income or more on rent, and then there's a lot of renters who are spending 70% of their income or more on rent. So when that's already the situation pre-pandemic, you know, then of course people can't afford to lose their jobs. I mean, losing a job means being homeless, and so the only thing between, you know, homelessness and not being homeless was this extra money from the feds, which is expiring next week.
Well, and with the interview you did with Eric Larson, he was saying that in normal times, between 10 and 12% of Americans were being evicted annually. So, I mean, yeah, it's a mind-boggling. But David, you've been very generous with your time today, and I really appreciate it. And I know how busy you are, and you've got your family waiting for you, no doubt, to turn the studio camera off.
They're in the garden. They're at the garden. It's okay.
It's such a nice day, too. DavidRovics.com. That's ROVICS. DavidRovics.com. You can find out how to support David's work further there for our radio listeners. And good luck, David. And thanks a lot again for coming on to Guerrilla Radio and talking to me today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Chris.
Kids, when I woke up at 5 a.m., looked at the news in time to hear the pundits condemn the actions of the arsonists who expressed so many desires when they made a barricade and set the FOP on fire. It happened in North Portland on the 51st consecutive night of demonstrations in this city. In this epic fight between those who defend inequities of the empire, those with a vision for the future that starts with the FOP on fire. between those who like to fumigate Portland's lovely streets, who prefer to use chemical weapons when they're not wearing those white sheets, or the ones who do Nazi cosplay like some of the cops they hired, just up until the night they set the FOP on fire. The cops driving from the suburbs, each day they come down to defend the interests of the rich, such as the mayor of this town. And Mayor Ted loves his tear gas, though he might say I'm a